Good afternoon and welcome to this Baptist Together webinar. And today we're talking about being a good charity trustee. My name is Caroline Sanderson and I'm the Legal Services Manager here at the Baptist Union of Great Britain. You are very welcome to join in the question and answers session, which is at the end. And if you want to submit any questions, there's an opportunity probably on the right-hand side or the bottom of your screen to send in questions as we go through this session. So please do that and I'll try and answer them at the end. So today I'm going to run through these things. I'm going to give an introduction to being a charity trustee and then think about who the charity trustees are likely to be in your church context. We'll talk about the duties that you'll have as a charity trustee and managing conflicts of interest, which is often crops up in church situations. We'll talk about payments to trustees and we'll look at liability and insurance, and also serious incident reporting to the Charity Commission, and where you can go for help if any of these items just cause you difficulties in the day-to-day running of the church. And as I said, at the end, there'll be a time for questions. So I'm sure you're aware that all Baptist churches are charities, whether or not they're registered with the Commission. So every church will have charity trustees. And every church, by virtue of being a charity, will be regulated by the Charity Commission. Now, I'm hoping that this webinar will be useful for those of you that are new trustees, but also for those of you that have been perhaps charity trustees of your church for some time, as a useful tool for refreshing your understanding of your obligations and duties as a charity trustee. And this webinar will be available online on our website after today, probably next week, together with the suite of webinars that we've recorded over the past year or so. So do encourage other trustees who aren't available today to log on and have a look at this session. So in the Baptist Church context, who are your church's charity trustees? Well, first of all, we look to statute to determine what a charity trustee role is. And so the Charities Act describes charity trustees as being the persons who have the general control and management of the administration of a charity. So what does that mean in a Baptist church context? Well, usually we would expect that the ministers, the deacons, elders, or you might call them the leadership team collectively, which would include the church secretary and treasurer, all have that collective equal responsibility and accountability in law. And these are the people that we would ordinarily expect to fulfil the role of your church charity trustees. Sometimes they're also referred to as managing trustees, so those terms can be used interchangeably if that is what you're more familiar with. But to be clear, the charity trustees or managing trustees are distinct from your property or holding or custodian trustees. So this might be a Baptist Trust Corporation, such as the Baptist Union Corporation, who are responsible for holding the church property on behalf of your church. We do have a guideline leaflet, C15, which is available on our website. You can use that link there. And I would encourage you to read that. It's called Help, I'm a Charity Trustee. So there's a lot of useful information in there for you that's relevant to Baptist churches particularly. But also I would encourage you to look at the Charity Commission Guide, CC3, called The Essential Trustee. And the Charity Commission also have a welcome pack you can look at if you're a new trustee. And do remember that all trustees' details have to be notified to the Commission, and the charity trustees need to make sure that if you're a registered charity, your register is kept up to date with all the details of your charity trustees. So let's think about the duties that you will have to fulfil as charity trustees of your church. The Charity Commission have helpfully given us a lot of information in this area, and so I thought that the best way of talking about this subject would be to refer to the 6 duties of a charity trustee as helpfully provided by the Charity Commission. So the Charity Commission has provided this puzzle of the 6 different the duties of the charity trustees, and I thought it would be helpful to go through these one by one to explain the different responsibilities that you will have as a church charity trustee. So the first one of these is to ensure that your charity is carrying out its purposes for the public benefit. So what's this about? Well, this tells you what your charity can and can't do within its purposes. And in a Baptist church context, this will usually be the advancement of the Christian faith according to the principles of the Baptist denomination, or some such similar wording. And this is looking at how your church charity is fulfilling its charitable purposes and how it's benefiting that section of the public or your local community. And the beneficiaries of your charity should be appropriate to your charitable aims, and you should be looking to reach out to that community about you. And you need to identify the difference that your church charity is really making in that community for the public benefit. Secondly, you need to be able to ensure that you're compliant with your charity's governing document and the law. Now, your governing document is invariably going to be your constitution for your church. And you really need to be familiar with what it says about the objects of the charity, who is to benefit from the charity, the powers that you have in that governing document, be comfortable with trustee payments and whether they're permissible, any restrictions in that constitution and any conflicts of interest. All of those things should be in your constitution, which should be sufficiently comprehensive and suitable, fit for purpose for a modern day charity. There are also statutory duties that church charity trustees have to comply with. You have to maintain records and you have to supply information to the Charity Commission, particularly if you're a registered charity. And you need to be up to date with filing accounts and annual returns and making changes to your charity registration details on the Commission's website if you are a registered charity. But of course, probably the majority of our churches still are not registered charities, but that does not mean to say that you still do not have to comply with laws relating to charities. And so there's a whole raft of other things you'll need to consider, such as data protection, safeguarding, health and safety, and so on. And it's important to emphasise that you don't need to be an expert in the law or in any of those particular areas, but you do need to take reasonable care and reasonable steps to keep up to date with changes. And certainly the Baptist Union provide a host of resources to help you to stay up to date with changes in the law. So thirdly, you need to act in your charity's best interests. Well, what does that mean? You need to be able to make balanced and informed decisions. And together with your co-trustees, you have to decide what will best enable the charity to fulfil its charitable purposes. Also in a Baptist church context, allowing for the role of church members in decision making. But you have to act in good faith and you have to recognise and deal with any conflicts of interest that arise. And I'll come on to that later on in this presentation. You have to make sure that trustee benefits are allowed and also be prepared to question and challenge each other in your church charity trustee or leadership team meetings. One of the chairs of the Association of Chairs mentioned a phrase, dysfunctional politeness, which I thought was quite helpful because sometimes in charity trustee contexts and in church meetings particularly, people can be particularly polite to each other or very nice and Christian and may not feel that they're willing or able to challenge decisions or what's being said. And I think it is important, particularly as charity trustees, to feel comfortable amongst each other and with each other to be able to question and challenge the decisions that are being made about the running of your church charity. And of course, you have to accept the majority decisions, even though sometimes they may not be what you wanted to happen. And finally, you need to be planning for the long term of the church as well as the short term. But it's not about preserving the charity for its own sake or serving personal interests. It's about being mindful of the charity's best interests and the people that you're serving. The Charity Commission also expects you to manage your charity or church's resources responsibly, and this is sometimes referred to as the duty of prudence. It's important to manage risks, to know your risk profile of the church charity, look at all the different activities and contracts that you have in place and make sure that you've got appropriate cover in place, and I'll come on to insurance. And you also have to be managing your assets and also the reputation of the charity. So it's not just about getting the resources your charity needs, but you also need to use those resources to support the charitable purposes and objectives of your charity. Just be careful not to overcommit the charity, and particularly take care if you're borrowing or spending money for the charity. And tied into that, of course, is having appropriate controls of your financial procedures. Don't fall into the trap of issuing blank cheques for one trustee to sign and then pass them on to another. That wouldn't be deemed to be good practice. And I think it's important to make sure that you've got lots of policies and procedures in place across the whole range of the activities that you will undertake as a church. And there are a range of draft policies that we can help you with, that we have available on the Baptist Union website and with our guideline leaflets too. So do have a look at those, or drop us an email if you ever have any questions. You also have to be responsible for the day-to-day running of the church site and the manse and any other land and buildings that you have. And of course too, there's a huge responsibility that is incumbent upon all of us involved in church life to look after the people involved in our churches and in regular contact with our churches and people that visit our churches. We have a responsibility to them and for our staff and volunteers. And I would draw your attention to the Charity Commission guidance for safeguarding duties for charity trustees, and I've put a link there because it is really of great importance that all charity trustees are aware of that. And again, there's a suite of information on the Baptist Union website on the safeguarding page, and there's an audit that you can carry out to assess how you're doing from a safeguarding point of view as church charity trustees. You're also expected to act with reasonable care and skill. Now, what does that mean? Well, charity trustees will usually come to the group of deacons and leadership team with a range of different skills, and that's great. No one is expecting to see a whole group of lawyers or a whole group of ministers or whatever skills you may bring. It's great to have a diversity of skill sets and for people to bring their experience from their walks of life into that context. But also you need to be prepared to take advice where it's necessary, whether that's from the association or the union or from professional advisors. But I would also encourage you to prepare for your meetings really carefully. It's really important for charity trustees to give enough time and thought and energy to the role. It's not always an easy role. I know I'm a charity trustee of other charities too, but it's really important that you're prepared for meetings. And I would say that on occasion we do have telephone calls coming into us where someone's saying, oh, I've got a church meeting tonight, could you just help me with this, that or the other? Of course, we're always willing to help in those situations, and sometimes things do crop up last minute. But do, if you can, be preparing in advance for your meetings so that you can make the most of your role and your contribution to that meeting. So get the information or advice that you need and use all the resources that are available to church charity trustees, and be prepared too in case something goes wrong. Just make sure that you've got procedures and policies in place to cover all eventualities. But I think what's important to emphasise is that in this role as a charity trustee, you need to be exercising extra care, more so than you would with your own affairs. There's almost a higher bar of skill and care that's required of you as a church charity trustee. And you also need to ensure that your church charity is accountable. Now, you have to meet various requirements from a legal, accounting and a reporting perspective, particularly if your church is registered with the Charity Commission, and you need to show that your church charity complies with the law and is effective. You also need to be accountable to your church members, of course, and any others, stakeholders or beneficiaries or those with an interest in your church. You need to ensure that your staff and any volunteers that you have, of which most churches have a large staff and a large volunteer group of people who are helping and involved in church activities, make sure that they're accountable to you as the church charity trustees and that they're acting within the scope of their delegated authority for the particular ministry areas or tasks that they have been set. Accountability shouldn't be deemed to be a burden, it should be an opportunity, a way that you can see that you can work together as one team to achieve that common purpose of your charitable objectives and your mission objectives. I mentioned earlier managing conflicts of interest, and so I thought I'd pick up this particularly tricky area with you today. It is a legal duty for charity trustees to make decisions that are in the best interests of the church charity, which I've already mentioned. But this means that if you have a personal or another interest that could affect your decision making as a church charity trustee, then this would be deemed to be a conflict of interest, and you should not place yourself in a position where there's going to be a conflict of interest, but it can be managed. A conflict of interest will also apply to connected persons, so not just yourself as the church charity trustee, but also if there's a situation where your child, your parent, grandparent, or brother or sister, or even your spouse or a civil partner of you, or a civil partner or spouse of any of those people I've just mentioned, your child, parent, grandparent, etc., if they are connected to you and somehow they are involved in a decision or some service to the charity, then that would also be deemed to be a conflict of interest. So that has to be managed. Conflicts of interest and also conflicts of loyalty, for example, to another organisation, need to be managed to protect the charity. And there are various ways that this Charities Act allows you to do that. So it's not as simple as saying if there's a conflict of interest, you can't continue with a decision making, a decision that needs to be made or a process that you need to follow, but it has to be very carefully managed. So I would refer you to our guideline leaflet, C16, which is on conflicts of interest and gives a lot more information about this particular area, because I know that in small churches often there are situations where a family can have a number of people who might be on the charity trustee board, and you might also have people who are helping out in the context of the church and its activities. So you just need to manage this conflict of interest point quite carefully. And tied into this are payments to trustees. Now, it's not normally allowed for trustees to receive payments other than, of course, expenses for travel or whatever other expenses they may have incurred on behalf of the work that they're doing for the charity. That's fine. And of course, ministers will invariably receive a stipend in your church, and they are, of course, a charity trustee. So what do we do in that situation? Well, your constitution should authorise payments to ministers and to any employees who are charity trustees. And I would refer you to the approved governing document, which is the AGD on the slides, to have a look at the clauses in that governing document. And if there are no provisions in your constitution, then you will invariably have to seek the consent of the Charity Commission where you want to make payments to charity trustees. You can pay for additional services from a trustee or a connected person if it's in the best interest of the charity. It might be that you want to take on the services of an electrician who might be the son of one of your charity trustees. That is fine, so long as you follow the procedures set out in our conflict of interest leaflet or in statute that we will explain, that is explained in the conflict of interest leaflet. You just need to make sure that you're managing that situation. And again, it's important to note that the number of paid trustees must be in the minority on your church charity trustee group. If you are going to take someone on and pay them as a trustee, the pay must be reasonable. It must be in the best interest of the charity to take them on or to take on their services. And if this also must be set out in writing. That is a requirement in statute for someone that is either a charity trustee or a connected person who's going to be providing a service or goods to the charity. So moving on to liability and insurance, and these are issues that often are a concern for churches, so I thought that I would touch on them today. You are probably aware that the vast majority of our Baptist churches are still unincorporated church charities, and this means that they don't have a legal status in their own right. The church cannot enter into contracts in the name of the church. It has to act through its church charity trustees. But this, of course, means that charity trustees can be held personally liable for some of the arrangements that are in place, or for a breach of trust, or if a third-party contract were to go wrong and someone may try to sue the church, then who would they sue? In a situation where the church charity is unincorporated, they would unfortunately have to sue the charity trustees. Not to frighten you, but there is also potentially a criminal liability that can arise for a health and safety executive prosecution situation. And there's also a civil liability that can arise, particularly if there's a breach of a fiduciary duty, which is where you don't act with sufficient care and skill or good faith, or you're not acting in accordance with your governing document, that liability is potentially unlimited where there's a loss to the charity. But trustees are usually entitled to an indemnity from church assets, and that is often provided for in a church charity constitution or in contracts with third parties. But the problem can arise if the assets of the church are insufficient to meet a claim that might be brought against the church. So one of the ways that we encourage churches to consider addressing this issue is to think about becoming a charitable incorporated organisation, or CIO. The CIO offers a limited liability structure, rather like a company, but it's designed specifically for charities and doesn't have any responsibility of reporting to Companies House. And there's a model that fits well with our ecclesiology as Baptist churches. And I would refer you to our guideline leaflet C11, which talks about charities and incorporation, but also we've done a webinar last year that's already available on the website, which gives you an introduction to CIOs and whether it would be right for your church. Of course, insurance is also really important in managing your liability, and it has to be sufficient, looking at the whole range of activities that the church has going on and looking at the church's risk profile. And I would encourage you to regularly review this. Again, we have a guideline leaflet L16 that's available to you on the website, and that talks about the key different types of insurance that you will want to have in place. And as a charity trustee, it's a collective responsibility of you all to make sure that you're not underinsured, that the level of insurance is sufficient for the activities and the risks that you have. Insufficient insurance in and of itself can be deemed to be a breach of trust and can put you in a precarious position as a charity trustee. So do check that your insurance cover is up to date, that you have no gaps in your cover, and that it's sufficient for your purposes. I've already mentioned that all of our charities are regulated by the Charity Commission, and one of the things that you'll need to think about is serious incident reporting. This applies to all of our churches and not just those charities that are registered with a Charity Commission. And what you are required to do is to report to the Charity Commission in a prompt manner anything that results in or risks loss of charity money or assets, damage to church charity property, harm to the church's work or its reputation, either in the local community or wider, harm to any of its beneficiaries or staff or volunteers, or indeed anybody else who comes into contact with your church through its work. And the Commission has recently updated its guidance in this regard, so I would recommend that you have another look at this. So what would some examples of serious incidents be? Well, if you've had a data breach and you've had to report it to the ICO because it was sufficiently serious to do that, then I would deem that something that would be reportable to the Charity Commission as a serious incident. You may find that you have had a fraud where the church has lost a significant sum of money. For example, a CEO fraud where someone poses as the CEO and a charity trustee or someone in the church falls into the trap of believing that they've had to pay money or buy something on behalf of the charity at the CEO's instructions, and that would be something you would need to report. Large to suspicious donations to the charity or the church in excess, let's say, of £25,000, that would be reportable to the Commission, or serious malicious damage or vandalism to the church site or its property, and anything that you would deem to be a reputational risk. Those incidents all need to be reported to the Charity Commission. And we again have a fairly new guideline leaflet that you can look at to identify what would be a serious incident beyond the examples that I've just given you. But I should say that if you fail to report to the Charity Commission something that they would deem to be sufficiently serious, then they would consider that to be a mismanagement of the charity. And the number of serious incident reports that the Commission has been dealing with over the last couple of years have gone up significantly as people are more aware of their reporting responsibilities. And if you've ever got any questions in this regard, you can always contact us here at the Baptist Union, and we'd be more than happy to talk through the scenario with you. So where can you go for help with all of these things that I've gone through, which probably are at times seem a little overwhelming, and also I guess the thing we often hear is that all of this charity regulation can distract churches from what they're really trying to achieve in the community and with their intention to bring the kingdom of God to people. But let me encourage you, and just to say there are plenty of places where you can go for help. Not least starting with us, the Baptist Union guideline leaflets. We have a whole suite of leaflets available which you can download from our website. The legal and operations team, of which I'm a part, have leaflets on managing properties, employment, charities, and there's a whole host of leaflets on trusts. And also, of course, our finance team produce a suite of leaflets as well, which will help you with all of the financial arrangements that you need to have and reporting that you need to do in that aspect as well. We also send out a monthly support services email that will often have some really helpful tips in them, and also look out for changes in the law, publications and updates to our guideline leaflets in that monthly email. And of course, Transform is an insert in the Baptist Together magazine that goes out to all of our churches. And if you want to email us, I've given you the support services email address there, so that you can drop us an email on any of these subjects that have cropped up today. The Charity Commission also has a lot of really helpful resources, and so that website I put up there is just the generic website, and then there's a raft of leaflets and guidance that's available to charity trustees on their website, in addition to the ones that I've already mentioned in this webinar. The other thing you may want to consider as well, if you are perhaps even a more experienced charity trustee, is thinking about the Charity Governance Code. This is something that is available at the website, the charitygovernancecode.org, and it offers you the chance to think about all of the ways in which your charity operates, looking at your purpose and looking at leadership, integrity, and all sorts of ways of being an effective group of church charity trustees. And there is a really helpful diagnostic tool that's available on the website. There's one for large charities with income of over £1 million, which obviously won't apply to our churches, but there is also one for smaller charities, and it's designed to be a tool that you can go through bit by bit together as a group to identify how you can develop high standards of governance in your charity, in the church. And all of this, of course, is designed to give you a sure footing, a security in understanding how you need to comply with the law, so that you have then a good foundation on which to go and do your mission and kingdom work in your churches. So I hope this has been helpful for you today, but as I said, do please contact us at any point with any questions, and I'm also happy to take some questions now from you. Many thanks.
Caroline, we have some questions already, mostly, well, quite a number about the definition of trustee, right back from the beginning of the presentation.
Right.
So let me try a simple one. Can both husband and wife be a trustee, or is that a conflict of interest?
It is possible for husbands and wives both to be charity trustees in church context. In fact, it's very common, particularly in smaller churches, where perhaps the membership is not as large as a bigger church. But yes, of course, it could potentially give rise to conflicts of interest, particularly, for example, if one of the charity trustees is the minister and the wife is, or the husband is another charity trustee, and they need to decide about making decisions for the minister's stipend. In that situation, that conflict of interest would need to be managed, and it would be inappropriate probably for the minister's spouse to vote in that situation. So that sort of conflict you would need to manage, but it is common, I would say, for husbands and wives and even children to be on the same church charity trustee or leadership team, but just be mindful of managing that conflict of interest. It's not prohibited, but it's just something you need to be aware of. Thank you.
It is fair to say that some churches do exclude that within their rules. It's not unusual to exclude because of the issues that it can create.
Yeah, absolutely, that's true, yeah.
We have another question about trustees taking advice. So this is Simon asks this question. A question about our obligations as trustees about getting legal advice. Had recent communication from the Baptist Pension Fund that says the following: these guidance notes are not legal advice. If you are concerned about your obligations, we strongly recommend that you take independent legal advice from a specialist legal advisor. We are also told that the legal aspects are complicated, so any specialist advice will be very costly and may outweigh the benefits of our small church, or even put it out of business. Can we decide not to take legal advice, having considered all the circumstances?
I think if you have considered all of the circumstances, it's a decision for you as a church charity trustee group to decide what is right for you, having regard to the best interests of the charity. If you feel that you've got a grip of what's in that leaflet or what the particular situation is, whether it's pensions or anything else, and you feel that you fully understand it, if there's a reference saying you may want to take legal advice on this point, you don't have to do so. But I think if you are struggling to understand a concept, or if there is a situation whereby you feel that the church's assets may be at risk, then it would always be advisable to consider taking independent professional advice, be it from a lawyer or in another situation, a different professional. Of course, sometimes that's going to cost money, and that often is a challenge. And I know that lawyers are particularly often given a reputation of being expensive. But I would say that if you are going to charity lawyers or lawyers that are familiar with our context, then hopefully the advice would be very tailored to your situation and wouldn't be too expensive. But I think it's just a decision you're going to have to weigh up, having regard to the complexity of the situation that you're facing, and whether or not you fully understand your obligations and the requirements for the church and also for yourselves as charity trustees, and any risks that may flow from not taking that advice.
Thank you, Caroline. Got some people asking questions about potentially where there is almost like a leadership team and something that's separately described as the trustee group. I've got a question from Jeremy that says, should the church trustees be a distinct body and meet as a group completely separate to the leadership team, or have complete overlap? And also, would you recommend some people who are not on the leadership team being charity trustees in the church setting?
So I think in this situation, and we get this a lot, there are lots of churches that might phone in and say, well, what you're describing doesn't necessarily look like the group of people we call church charity trustees. I mentioned that the usual situation is that the ministers, deacons or leadership team would be deemed to be charity trustees, but that's not because it's the title that we've given them. It's because we're looking at the statutory definition, which I mentioned was the persons having the general control and management of the administration of the charity. Now, in every church that may look slightly different, but what you have to think about, it's a question of fact and degree. What are those people on your leadership team doing? If they are the people who are in essence making those day-to-day decisions about the running of the charity, then irrespective of what you call them, statute and probably the courts would determine that they are charity trustees by virtue of the role that they have. So sometimes the label you give people, the title you give them is irrelevant. It's looking at what their role is and whether that would determine someone as being a church charity trustee or not. So you by all means you can have people that you might want to invite onto the leadership team, but if they're making decisions collectively with you in that leadership team environment, and they're making those decisions about the control and the running of the charity, then they're probably going to be deemed to be church charity trustees. It's not about, whether you're described as being an elder or a charity trustee or a member of the leadership team. It's about looking at that role that you're fulfilling in the church context, and whether, when you look at the statutory definition, that would deem you to be a charity trustee. Okay,
yeah, there was a follow-up. I did ask a clarification of Jeremy before asking you. He said he follows up to say we're a registered charity and have tended to view the trustees as doing the admin/good governance bit, and then they report to and support the spiritual leadership team. trying to just get a handle of where those two, how that works. And it sounds to me like the spiritual leadership team may well be trustees as well.
I think it's difficult for us to say without knowing the full context, and I think you'd have to decide that. And you could take a view, but if there was ever a situation where it had to be determined for whatever reason, then it would again come down to what those people in the spiritual leadership team or these elders with spiritual responsibility are doing. I mean, if they're setting, if they're really involved in setting and discerning the vision for the church, then it might be that you would argue that they are also charity trustees. It does depend on the roles that they're fulfilling, irrespective of the labels that people are given.
Okay. Got one here. Can you define the role of the chair of trustees?
I haven't actually covered the role of the chair of trustees today, and it's something that I am happy to discuss with you if you want to drop me an email. But I think generally speaking, it's someone that can be appointed from amongst your group to take a lead in managing the meetings and making sure that everyone gets the papers in good time, that people are reporting back to the group of charity trustees effectively and promptly, and I guess having some level of oversight of that particular meeting. But I would remind you that the legal responsibilities of charity trustees are collective, and there is no one person who would carry any legal responsibility, certainly separate from the rest of the group. But if you want to appoint someone to take a lead in terms of chairing meetings and things, then that's absolutely fine.
Okay, a specific one here. Have there been any cases of charity trustees of Baptist churches having been sued? As a new charity trustee, it is something that worries me personally.
I can understand that you would be worried by that, because, as I mentioned briefly, the majority of our Baptist churches are still unincorporated associations, and we have now, I believe, approximately 80 or so churches that have become charitable incorporated organisations, and I think there's approximately 20 or so that are companies limited by guarantee, which is not a structure that we encourage anymore now that we have the CIO structure available. But yes, of course, if you're a church charity trustee, there is a potential personal liability that you could face. But I should also say that even as a member of a Baptist church, because of Baptist church governance and the way that decisions are made in Baptist churches, if there is a decision where the members of the church have also been involved in deciding something, and for whatever reason something were to go wrong, then there is also a possibility that Baptist church members too could face a potential personal liability. But in the main, it's the church charity trustees that would be sued collectively if there were to be a claim by a third party. So the CIO structure is one that we would encourage your church to look at, for you to consider, because it offers that limited liability structure. And that means that the CIO, which would be the church CIO, would be able to enter into contracts in the name of the church CIO. The CIO would therefore provide a means by which the church charity trustees would be protected from that liability, certainly for contracts. Of course, there's always going to be a potential liability for any church charity trustee if there's a breach of trust or breach of your fiduciary duty. But that is why it's important to stay on top of things and exercise the good care and skill and all of these duties that I've referred to today. And of course, insurance is really important to make sure that you've got all of your insurances in place to manage that risk. I think if you're regularly reviewing your risk profile, if as a church you've got a number of activities that you're undertaking, a number of visitors to your church, lots of third-party contracts, then it might be that becoming a CIO would be a good idea for your church, but it's not right for every church. And if you're in a smaller church or a church where there's not much that goes on beyond the Sunday services, then it may be that the risk profile of the church is very low, and in which case being a church charity trustee also will therefore have less risk involved.
But to answer the specific question, there have been instances where...
Oh yeah, sorry, to go back to the actual question, I am not aware of any Baptist churches that have been sued for where the church charity trustees have been sued as an unincorporated association. That's not something we're aware of. I know that, you know, for example, unincorporated associations with charity trustees can be sued. For example, golf clubs I know have been sued, and other associations where there have been things that have gone wrong and the charity trustees have been found liable. But I'm not aware of a situation in a Baptist church context.
That's helpful. So I'm just looking to see if we've got any more questions. We've got a question about can trustees be paid for being a trustee? I think you have covered that, but it might just be worth.
You shouldn't be paid for being a trustee. If you are there just to be a trustee, you should not be paid for that role. If you are a trustee by virtue of your paid role, for example, your appointment as a minister, then it is okay to receive payment in that role, but your constitution should specifically provide for that. Otherwise, you need to get permission from the Charity Commission.
Okay, thank you. I think that is all the questions we have. I'm just going to do a quick scroll through to check, and if anybody does wish to submit a question, then now would be a good time to do it. Well, there's one question here. What happens when the trustees disagree with others in the church over the vision and how to move forward? So perhaps you've got a conflict between trustees and members, and or another sort of diaconate type body where they're not trustees.
That's a difficult one. I'm not sure I'm necessarily the best placed person to give you an answer. I think, you know, in the Baptist church context, we are a congregational governance context. Our churches are, our members in our churches are involved in the decision making of the charity and in its determining and discerning the mind of God and Christ for the vision and the future of the church and its mission. And I think that it's probably very difficult if the church charity trustees have a different sense from the membership. And I would encourage you in that situation probably to involve your local association to offer you support in that situation, and support from elsewhere within the Baptist Union. I think that it would be an uncomfortable situation if the charity trustees felt that they wanted to go one way and the church membership felt strongly that they had discerned that the church should go a different way, or that the vision should be different. I would think that it would be in the charity trustees' best interests not to make a decision about the future of the church charity if it wasn't one that the whole church was on board with.
We've got two people that actually asked, will the webinar and slides be available on the website?
Yeah, the slides and the webinar are available on the website. So I think to access the slides, you will need to watch the webinar to access the slides. Yeah. I
think we will also post the slides as a download.
The slides can be posted as a download. I'm happy with that, yeah.
But the video replay will also be available.
Yeah. I think next week sometime.
Early next week.
Yeah.
Well, that appears at this moment in time. I'm just going to have another quick check. No, that is it. We have no further questions at this point in time. So thank you, Caroline.
Happy days. Thank you very much for joining us, and do let us know if you have any more help. If you need any more help from us or anything else, we can.
Sorry,
a last-minute question.
Very last-minute question. It's just popped up on screen from Roger. So Roger's got in just before the end.
Save the worst till last, Roger.
He says, how many trustees should you have for a church of about 80 people?
I would say, what does your charity constitution say on this? You need to sort of be in line with what your constitution says, but I think that it would be acceptable to have anywhere between sometimes 3 and 8 charity trustees would be a sort of fairly standard size. You can have more. You may not want to have more. Some church charity trustee boards are quite large in number, but you know, it's a decision for you really. I think the Commission would hope that you would have at least 3 as a minimum.
no, the best practice guidance is between 5 and 12
Yeah.
on the general charity.
12 is
Trustee
probably, about the far as the max that you'd want to go to, but I would say, anywhere between, 5 and 12, maybe 8 in the middle to keep everyone happy. But sometimes it's difficult to recruit church charity trustees too, particularly when people are worried about personal liability or if you've got a smaller church. But I think sometimes thinking about the CIO structure might be one way of bringing comfort to people who are perhaps reluctant to take on that personal liability. And it can be a challenge finding people who are willing to step up and take on the extra work and responsibilities. Now that I've laid them all out for you.
Okay. Genuinely, that looks like that is the end of the Q&A. Sorry that we had that very late entry.
Fine.
So thank you very much, Caroline.
All right, you're welcome.